Around the year 900, a Norwegian king had a problem. His name was Ragnvaldr Heidenheiri. He was a minor king in a place called Vestfold, a small piece of a much larger, chaotic Norway, where he needed to prove he was important. He needed to show that his blood was special, that his right to rule was not just a matter of luck or force, but of destiny. So he did what any powerful man of his time did. He hired a poet. The poet was Theodulfr of Vinir. We don't know much about him personally, but we know what he created for Ragnvaldr. It was a poem called Ynglingatal. The name means totally of the Ynglings. The Ynglings were a legendary dynasty of Swedish kings. They were said to be descended from the gods themselves, specifically from Freyr. What Theodulfr did was create a bridge of words. He built a poetic family tree that stretched from his patron, Ragnvaldr, all the way back through 27 generations to the mythical kings of Uppsala and, by extension, to the divine. The poem is short and dense. Each stanza briefly mentions a king, how he lived and how he died. One king fell off his horse. Another was burned to death by his own people during a famine. A third drowned in a vat of mead. It was not a glamorous list. But it was a list, it was a chain of names that connected a small-time Norwegian ruler to a semi-divine past. Theodulfr's poem was not just art, it was a political document, it was a piece of propaganda. It stated, in complex and formal verse, that Ragnvaldr was not just some ambitious warlord. He was the heir to an ancient and sacred lineage. He belonged. His power was legitimate. The poem was history, but it was history with a purpose. It was a secret whispered in the form of a song, a claim to power hidden inside a list of dead kings. This was the work of a skald. Number 17, a poem was a machine built of sound. Egil Skallagrimson was in a bad spot. It was the middle of the 10th century, maybe around 948. He was shipwrecked on the coast of Northumbria near York. This was a terrible place for him to be. The ruler of Northumbria was King Eric Bloodaxe. Eric and Egil had a long and bloody history, and Egil had killed Eric's son. Eric had declared Egil an outlaw to be killed on sight by any man in Norway. Now, by a twist of fate, the poet was in the king's hands. Eric wanted him dead. He planned to have him executed the next morning. Egil had one friend at court, a man named Ermbjorn. Ermbjorn went to the king and argued for Egil's life. He said that killing a man at night without a trial was shameful. He convinced Eric to wait until morning. Then he went to Egil. He told him he had one chance. He had to compose a poem, not just any poem, a great poem, a praise poem, a drapa, for the very man who wanted to kill him. He had one night to do it. This is where the secret of the Skalds begins. What Egil had to do was not just write some nice words. He had to build a complex machine made of sound. The poetic form he had to use was called Drottkavet, the courtly meter. It was the highest, most respected form of poetry. And it was incredibly difficult. Following its rules was like solving a Rubik's Cube while juggling. First, a stanza in Drottkavet had 8 lines. Each line had to have exactly 6 syllables. 3 of those syllables had to be stressed. This gave the poetry its rhythm, a strong marching beat. But that was just the start. The lines were connected in pairs. Each pair of lines had to be linked by alliteration. In the first line of a pair, 2 syllables had to alliterate. They were called the props. In the second line of the pair, the first stressed syllable had to alliterate with the props from the line before. It was called the head stave, so you had a strict pattern of repeating sounds woven through the lines. But that still wasn't enough. There was also rhyme, not the end rhyme we're used to, like cat and hat. Skaldic poetry used internal rhyme. In the odd-numbered lines 1, 3, 5, 7, there was half rhyme or assonance. 2 syllables in the line had to have similar vowel sounds, but different consonants. For example, hand and cat. In the even-numbered lines 2, 4, 6, 8, there was full rhyme, or consonants. 2 syllables had to have the same consonants and vowels. For example, stone and bone. And these rhymes couldn't be just anywhere. They had to fall on stressed syllables within the line. So Egil, in a cold cell with death waiting for him, had to do all of this simultaneously. 6 syllables per line, 3 stresses per line, a specific alliteration pattern connecting every 2 lines, a specific internal rhyme pattern in every single line. To fail at any one of these rules was to fail completely. The poem would be considered flawed, clumsy. It would be an insult to the king's intelligence. It would guarantee his execution. He worked all night. The saga says a servant girl kept distracting him, but he eventually finished. In the morning, he was brought before King Eric. He stood in the hall in front of the man whose son he had killed, and he recited the poem. He called it Hofudlassen, the head ransom. It was 20 stanzas long. It praised Eric's generosity, his skill in battle, the way he made his enemies eagles fat with corpses. It was a masterpiece of the form. Every rule was followed perfectly. The rhythm was powerful. The rhymes and alliterations were flawless. The language was dense and complex. King Eric listened. The saga says the other men in the hall were impressed. It was an incredible performance. To create such a perfect piece of art under such pressure was a feat of genius. Eric was a hard man, but he understood the value of what he had just heard. A king's reputation lived on in the poems of the Skalds. A bad poem would be forgotten. A great poem would be remembered and repeated for generations. Egil had given him a form of immortality. So Eric made a decision. He would not kill Egil. He gave him his head as a reward for the poem. He let him go. The poem itself was a secret key. Its complexity was a barrier. Only a trained skald could create it. Only a sophisticated audience could fully appreciate it. It wasn't just pretty language. It was a demonstration of intellectual power, of control, of mastery over the most difficult art form of their age. A skald wasn't just a storyteller, he was a craftsman of the highest order. His poems were not just songs. They were intricate engines of sound built to carry a message, secure a reputation, or, in Egil's case, save a life. Number 16 language was a secret code. The first skald we know by name is Bragi Boddason the Old. He lived in Norway in the early 9th century, long before Egil's time. We have fragments of his work, but his most famous poem is the Ragnarsdrapa. He supposedly composed it as a gift for a legendary Swedish king named Ragnar Lodbrok. The poem describes the images painted on a magnificent shield that Ragnar had given him. It is one of the oldest pieces of skaldic poetry that survives, and it is almost impossible to understand without a key. This is because Bragi, like all skalds after him, used a secret code. The code had 2 main components, heti and kenningar. Understanding them is like learning a new language, a language spoken only by the poets and their educated patrons. A heti is the simpler of the two. It's basically a synonym, a poetic word for a common thing. Instead of saying mon, a skald might say warrior, hero, lord, or any of 100 other poetic alternatives. Instead of sword, he might say blade, brand, or flame of battle. These were lists of words that poets memorized. They were useful for meeting the strict metrical rules of Drottvet. If you needed a 1-syllable word for king, you used 1 heti. If you needed a 2-syllable word, you used another. It added richness and variety to the language, but the real secret, the heart of the code, was the kenning. A kenning is a way of describing something without naming it directly. It's a small riddle embedded in the line of a poem. It's a compound expression that uses figurative language to stand in for a simple noun. The kennings have 2 parts, a base word and a determinant. For example, instead of saying sea, a skald might say whale road. Road is the base word. Whale is the determinant that tells you what kind of road it is. Instead of ship, a skald might say wave horse. Instead of battle, he might say storm of swords. These are fairly straightforward, but the skalds didn't stop there. They layered kennings on top of each other, creating incredibly complex and convoluted phrases that could stretch across multiple lines of a poem. This is where the code becomes truly difficult to crack. A skald might create a kenning for warrior. A simple one would be tree of battle. Tree is the base word for a man, and battle tells you what kind of man. Now, he could take that kenning and complicate it. Instead of battle, he could use a kenning for battle, like din of spears. So warrior becomes tree of the din of spears. It gets even more complex. A famous example from the skald Thorder Sherrickson describes a woman. He calls her the goddess of the drink of the land of the cap of the giant skull. To understand this, you have to unpack it layer by layer. The giant's skull refers to the sky in Norse mythology. The cap of the sky is a mountain. The land of the mountain is rock. The drink of rock is ale, since ale was sometimes associated with a myth about a giant's mead. The goddess of ale is a woman. So, the goddess of the drink of the land of the cap of the giant's skull is a very complicated way of saying woman. Why would they do this? It wasn't just to be difficult. The code served several purposes. First, it was a display of skill. Decomposing and understanding these kennings required immense learning. A poet had to know hundreds of myths, legends, and poetic precedents. An audience member, a king, or a jarl proved his own wisdom and sophistication by understanding the poem. It created an exclusive club. If you understood the kennings, you were part of the inner circle of the court. And if you didn't, you were an outsider. Second, the kennings packed a huge amount of information and imagery into a very small space. The phrase, feeder of ravens, is a kenning for a warrior. It doesn't just mean warrior, it evokes a whole scene. It brings to mind a battlefield after the fight, with ravens feasting on the dead. It's a brutal, vivid image, all contained in 3 words. It made the poetry dense with meaning and association. When Bragi Boddason described the shield in his Ragnarsdrapa, he used this code. He spoke of the blood snake, a sword, and the wound sea blood. He described the god Thor fishing for the world serpent, not in plain terms, but through a series of kennings that alluded to the myth without ever stating it directly. For his audience in the 9th century, this was high art. It was a shared secret, a puzzle that poet and listener solved together. For us, more than 1,000 years later, it is a locked door. It was only in the 13th century that an Icelandic scholar and politician named Snorri Sturluson wrote a textbook, the Prose Edda, to explain the code. He worried that future generations would forget how to understand the old poems. Without Snorri's key, the secrets of Bragi and the first Skalds would have been lost completely. Their language would be nothing more than beautiful, incomprehensible noise. Number 15, a poem could be legal evidence. In the early 11th century, around the year 1028, a man named Thormodr Kolbrunnar Skald stood in a tense situation. He was a skald in the court of King Olaf II of Norway, the man who would later become Saint Olaf. Olaf was at war with the Danish king Knut the Great. A major sea battle had just taken place at the Helgia River in what is now Sweden. The outcome was messy. Both sides claimed victory. Both sides had taken heavy losses. History is written by the victors, but first, the victors have to agree on what happened. In the aftermath, a dispute arose. One of King Olaf's allies, a Swedish jarl named Onundur Olafsson, felt he hadn't received enough credit. Knut's forces had set a trap, and Onundur claimed that his own clever tactics had saved Olaf's fleet from total destruction. He felt his contribution was being overlooked. Tensions were high between the king and his powerful ally. An argument in a hall full of armed men could easily turn violent. This is where Thormodr the Skald stepped in. He had been on King Olaf's flagship during the battle. He had seen everything, and as the court poet, his job was not just to entertain, but to remember. In a society that was largely illiterate, the memory of a trained skald was a vital record. His mind was the archive. A poem, once composed and performed, was a fixed account. It could be memorized and repeated by others, spreading the official version of events. King Olaf turned to his skald. He asked Thormodr to compose a poem about the battle, but he gave him a specific instruction. He told him to make sure Onundur's contribution was included. He understood that a poem that ignored the jarl would be an insult. It would poison the alliance. The poem had to be both a praise of the king and a validation of his ally. It had to be politically useful history, so Thormodr composed. The verses he created were later incorporated into the sagas that tell the story of King Olaf. In the poem, he describes the fierce fighting. He uses the standard kennings for battle and warriors, but he also includes specific details. He names Onundr. He describes how the Swedes broke the enemy's blockade. He confirms the Jarl's story. The act of performing this poem in the king's hall was a legal and political event. It was like submitting a sworn statement into the official record. Thormodr was not just a poet, he was a witness. His verse was testimony. Because of the strict rules of Drottningvad, the poem was seen as difficult to fabricate on the spot. Its complexity gave it an air of truthfulness. A lie could be simple, but a lie constructed within the intricate cage of skaldic meter, full of correct kennings and allusions, seemed less likely. It required too much effort. Snorri Sturluson, writing his History of the Norwegian Kings 2 centuries later, used poems like Thormodr's as his primary sources. He treated them with the respect a modern historian would give to a contemporary document. He often quoted a stanza from a skaldic poem to prove a point or verify a fact. He wrote, "We base our history mostly on the poems which were recited for the chieftains themselves or their sons. We accept as true everything that is found in those poems about their expeditions and battles." He trusted the Skalds because they were composing for a critical audience. If Thormodr had lied about the battle, the other men who were there, the king, the Jarl, the other warriors, would have known. Or his reputation and possibly his life would have been at risk. A Skald's poem was therefore more than art. It was a public record. It settled disputes. It assigned credit and blame. It shaped the memory of events. When Thormodr, Kolbrunnar Skald, stood up and recited his verses about the Battle of Helgeia, he was not just entertaining the court. He was solidifying an alliance, writing the first draft of history, and acting as a witness in the court of public memory. His poem was a legal document, its truthfulness guaranteed by the complexity of its form and the presence of other witnesses. Number 14, the poet was a political weapon. Sivatar Thordarson was perhaps the most successful skald of his age. Born in Iceland around 995, he rose to become the most trusted advisor and friend to King Olaf II of Norway. His career shows that a skald was not just a court entertainer or a historian. He was a diplomat, a political strategist, and a powerful voice in the king's inner circle. His poems were instruments of statecraft. Sivatar came to Olaf's court as a young man and quickly impressed the king with his skill. For over 15 years, he served Olaf, composing dozens of poems praising his battles, his generosity, and his efforts to bring Christianity to Norway. But his role went far beyond that of a poet laureate. King Olaf used Sivatar as his envoy on sensitive missions. Sometime around 1026, Olaf sent Sivatar on a diplomatic journey to Sweden. The purpose was to negotiate the marriage of Olaf's young son, Magnus, to the daughter of the Swedish king. This was a critical alliance, and Olaf entrusted the mission not to a warrior or a nobleman, but to his poet. Sivatar composed a poem about this journey, the Ostfararvisur, or Verses of an Eastern Journey. In it, he describes the difficult trip and his negotiations at the Swedish court. The poem is not just a travelogue. It's a political report. It subtly communicates the challenges he faced, the personalities he dealt with, and the success of his mission. By turning his diplomatic report into a poem, he ensured it would be remembered and repeated, cementing his own reputation and the king's political victory. But the most striking example of Sivatar's political function came later, after King Olaf was killed in the Battle of Stiklestad in 1030. Olaf's enemies, led by the Danish king Kut the Great, took control of Norway. Kut installed his son Svein as the ruler. Svein's rule was harsh and unpopular. The Norwegian chieftains who had helped overthrow Olaf began to regret their decision. They started to think about bringing back Olaf's young son Magnus, who was in exile. Sivadr, who had been on a pilgrimage to Rome when Olaf was killed, returned to Norway. He found the country suffering under the new regime. He saw his chance to use his poetry to change the political landscape. He composed a poem that became known as Berzoglisvisor, the Plain-Speaking Verses. It was an extraordinary political document. He recited the poem in public, in a hall full of chieftains, many of whom were loyal to the new king, Svein. The poem was a direct and daring piece of political criticism. It was addressed to the new rulers. But it was not a simple insult. It was a carefully crafted piece of advice, a warning disguised as a praise poem. Sivadr used the complex rules of skaldic poetry to his advantage. He embedded his criticism within layers of kennings and difficult syntax. This made it hard for Svein's men to accuse him of open treason. In the poem, he advises Svein on how to be a better king. He contrasts Svein's harsh laws with the just rule of the former king, Olaf. He reminds the chieftains of the golden age they had under Olaf, the very man they had betrayed. He speaks of the people's suffering, the unfair taxes, the loss of old rights. He warns Svein that a king who does not listen to his people will not rule for long. Every line was a carefully aimed blow. The poem was a political bombshell. It gave voice to the growing discontent in the country. It was plain speaking because it cut through the fear and silence. It reminded the Norwegian nobles of their duty and their heritage. It was a call to action, hidden in plain sight. Shortly after Sivadr performed this poem, the movement to bring back Magnus gained unstoppable momentum. The Norwegian chieftains rose up, drove out Svein, and installed Olaf's son as the new king. Sivadr's poem did not single-handedly cause this revolution. But it was a catalyst. It was a piece of powerful political propaganda that articulated the feelings of the elite and pushed them toward action. Sivadr Thordarson was not just a poet, he was a kingmaker. He understood that a well-crafted stanza could be more powerful than a sword. His life is a clear demonstration that for the Vikings, poetry was not a trivial pursuit. It was a tool of power, a weapon used in the high-stakes game of politics and war. Number 13, memory was a structured palace. How did they do it? How did the Skald, like Sivadr or Egil, compose, edit, and memorize thousands of lines of the most metrically complex poetry in European history, all without writing anything down? The world of the Skalds was almost entirely oral. Writing on vellum was known, but it was expensive and rare, used for laws or religious texts, not for composing poems. The Skald's primary tool was his own mind. The secret lies in how they used the structure of the poetry itself as a powerful memory aid. Think of a Drottkavat stanza. It has 8 lines. Each line has 6 syllables. It has a strict pattern of alliteration and 2 different kinds of internal rhyme. The word order is often scrambled to fit the meter, with parts of a single thought or kenning scattered across several lines. This sounds like it would make it harder to remember, but in fact the opposite is true. The dense network of rules created a self-correcting system. Imagine a skald trying to recall a stanza. If he got a word wrong, the whole structure would collapse. The syllable count would be off. The alliteration would break. The internal rhyme would disappear. It would be like trying to fit the wrong piece into a jigsaw puzzle. The error would be immediately obvious, not just to the poet, an expert, but to his educated audience. The rules acted as a powerful error-checking mechanism. This is very different from trying to memorize free verse or simple prose. If you forget a word in a simple sentence, you can often substitute another one without anyone noticing. But in Drottkavat, every single word is locked into place by a web of phonological and metrical connections to the words around it. Changing one word means you have to change several others to make the rules work again. It was easier to remember the original than to try and improvise a new version that still fit the form. The kennings and hiti also served as memory aids. They were a specialized vocabulary that the poet had mastered. These were not just random phrases, they were built on a shared body of knowledge, primarily Norse mythology. To remember a kenning for the god Thor, like Slayer of Giants, the poet was tapping into a vast network of stories and characters that he and his audience knew intimately. The myths provided a framework, a mental palace in which the kennings were the furniture. Each kenning was a hook on which to hang a part of the poem. Furthermore, Skalds didn't just compose a finished poem in one go. The process was likely one of careful, deliberate construction, line by line, stanza by stanza. A skald might work on a single stanza for hours or even days, polishing it in his mind, testing different word combinations until every rule was satisfied and the meaning was precise. He would recite it over and over, engraving it into his memory through repetition. The story of Egil Skallagrimsson composing his Head Ransom in a single night is famous precisely because it was such an incredible feat, far beyond the normal process of composition. The Skalds also likely trained for years. A young, aspiring poet would apprentice himself to a master skald. He would learn the meters, memorize hundreds of existing poems, and master the vast vocabulary of heti and kennings. He was training his mind, building the mental structures necessary to handle this immense cognitive load. It was a discipline as rigorous as the training of a warrior. The final performance was also part of the process. Reciting the poem in a king's hall in front of a critical audience was the final test. The poem was now a public object. Others in the audience would memorize it, especially other skalds. It would enter the oral tradition. This shared responsibility for remembering the poem helped ensure its survival. If one person forgot a line, another might remember it. The mind of a skald was not a chaotic storehouse of words. It was a highly organized system, a structured palace of memory. The rules of the poetry were not constraints to be overcome. They were the very architecture of that palace. They were the scaffolding that allowed these incredible verbal structures to be built, stored, and transmitted across generations without the aid of writing. The true secret was that the complexity of the art form was also the key to its survival. Number 12, a praise poem was a contract for payment. Gunnlaugur Ormstunga, or Gunnlaug Serpent Tongue, was an Icelandic skald who lived around the year 1000. His story, told in Gunnlaug's Saga Ormstungu, is a classic tale of a restless poet seeking his fortune abroad. Like many Icelanders of his time, he knew that the best place to profit from his poetic skill was not at home, but in the wealthy courts of the kings and jarls of Norway, Sweden, England, and Ireland. His story reveals a crucial secret of the Skald's praise poem was not just a gift, it was a transaction. It was the opening move in a negotiation for wealth and status. As a young man, Gunnlaugur traveled to Norway to the court of Jarl Eiríkur Hakansson. He announced that he had a poem for the Jarl. The Jarl was busy, but told him to come back later. Gunnlaugur was impatient and proud, and he insisted on performing it immediately. The Jarl, annoyed, finally agreed. Gunnlaugur recited his poem, a flocker, which was a shorter, less formal type of praise poem than a full drapa. When he was done, Jarl Eiríkur was unimpressed. He said the poem was decent, but not great. As a reward, he offered Gunnlaugur a new axe. This was a paltry payment, an insult. A proper reward for a good poem would be a gold arm ring, a fine cloak, or even a sword with a decorated hilt. An axe was a tool. The Jarl was making a statement about the quality of the work. But Gunnlaugur was quick-witted, hence his nickname Serpent Tongue. He took the axe and recited another impromptu verse saying that the Jarl was not very generous with his gifts, and that this axe would soon be stained red. This was a thinly veiled threat. The Jarl, surprisingly, was amused by his audacity and told him to come back later for a better reward. The interaction shows the system at work. The skald offers a poem. The patron offers a reward. The quality and value of both are judged publicly. A great poem demanded a great gift. To give a poor gift for a great poem was to show yourself as stingy and uncultured, damaging your reputation. Conversely, to give a great gift for a poor poem made you look like a fool. It was a high-stakes social game. Gunnlaugur continued his travels. He went to England and presented a drapa to King Aethelred. The king was pleased and rewarded him handsomely with a scarlet cloak lined with the finest furs and a gold bracelet. This was the kind of payment a top-tier skald could expect. He then went to Ireland, to the court of King Sigtryg Silkbeard in Dublin. He recited another poem. Sigtryg was so impressed that he wanted to give Gunnlaugur 2 ships. His treasurer advised him that this was an excessive reward, that kings usually gave rings, swords, and cloaks. The king, not wanting to look foolish, agreed. He gave Gunnlaugur fine clothes and a gold ring. This system, known as the gift economy, was central to Viking Age society. A leader's power was demonstrated by his ability to attract loyal followers and reward them for their service. The most important gift a king could give was his generosity. A skald's poem was a unique commodity in this economy. It was a luxury good, but unlike a sword or a ring, its value was not just in its material, its value was in its ability to confer fame. The poem, the Drapa, was a public declaration of the patron's greatness. It would be memorized and repeated, spreading the king's reputation far and wide. It was a form of permanent propaganda. In a world without newspapers or mass media, the voice of the skald was the primary way a ruler could build his personal brand. He was paying for good publicity, he was investing in his own legacy, so when a skald like Gunnlaugur Ormstunga arrived at court, he was not a humble artist seeking patronage. He was a highly skilled professional offering a valuable service. The poem was his side of the contract. The performance was the delivery of the goods. The gift from the king was the payment. The entire transaction was a public spectacle that reinforced the status of both the poet and the patron. The skald got wealth and fame. The king got immortality. It was a good trade. Number 11, an insult could get you killed. Poetry was a source of wealth and fame, but it could also be a deadly weapon. The Vikings had a specific term for a poem designed to insult, mock, and curse an enemy. It was called a nid, and creating a nid was one of the most dangerous things a skald could do. It was considered a magical attack, a verbal blow that could inflict real harm on its target. It was not just slander, it was a form of character assassination that, in the honor-bound society of the Viking Age, often led to violence. The laws of early Iceland took nid very seriously. The Gragas, the medieval Icelandic law code, had specific prohibitions against it. Composing a few lines of mockery about someone could result in a fine. Composing a full stanza of nid could result in being declared an outlaw. This meant anyone could kill you without legal penalty. The law treated a vicious poem with the same gravity as a physical assault. Why was it so powerful? A nid didn't just call someone a coward or a fool. It often attacked their honor in the most profound way possible, frequently with accusations of sexual deviancy. The most serious form of insult was to accuse a man of being sexually passive, of taking the woman's role. This accusation, called ergi, was the ultimate stain on a man's honor. It suggested he was unmanly and therefore unfit to be a warrior or a leader. Such an insult could not be ignored. It had to be answered, usually with violence. A powerful story about the danger of nid comes from the Icelandic skald Thorleifur Jarlskald. In the late 10th century, he was a poet in the service of Jarl Hakon, the powerful ruler of Norway. For some reason, Thorleifur fell out of favor with the Jarl. He was forced to flee, and his property in Norway was confiscated. Thorleifur was furious and decided to take his revenge not with a sword, but with a poem. He sailed back to Norway in disguise. He came to the Jarl's hall during a great feast. Posing as an old ragged beggar, he got close to the Jarl. Then he threw off his disguise and recited the nid he had composed. The saga says that as he spoke, the lights in the hall began to flicker and go out. Swords started to rattle in their scabbards. The poem was so powerful, so magically charged, that it was having a physical effect on the world. The content of the poem was vicious. It accused Jarl Hakon of all manner of wickedness and perversion. It ended with a powerful curse. The saga tells us the immediate aftermath. Jarl Hakon was not just angry, he was physically ill. He grew pale, and his beard began to fall out. The poem was a direct magical assault that had wounded him. He immediately ordered his men to find and kill Thorleifr, but the Skald had already vanished into the night. The story doesn't end there. Thorleifr composed a second magical poem against the Jarl, this one from the safety of Iceland. This poem was designed to call up evil spirits Landvatter to drive Hakon from Norway. The saga reports that after this, Jarl Hakon became paranoid and unstable. His rule began to crumble. He was eventually betrayed by his own slave and killed while hiding in a pigsty. The saga directly attributes his downfall to the power of Thorleifr's insulting verses. Whether we believe the magical elements of the story, the social reality it reflects is clear. An insult poem was a declaration of war. It was an attack on a man's reputation, his honor, and his very identity. It could not be left unanswered. Egil Skallagrimsson also used this power. When the Norwegian king Eric Bloodaxe and his queen Gunhild drove him from Norway, Egil went to an island, took a horse's head, and mounted it on a pole. He pointed the head towards the mainland and recited a formal curse, a nid, against the king and queen, calling on the spirits of the land to drive them out. Soon after, Eric was overthrown and forced to flee to England. The nid was the dark side of the Skald's art. It showed that the power to create fame through praise was matched by the power to create infamy through insult. A Skald's tongue could build a king's reputation or tear it down. It could earn him a gold ring or a death sentence. The words were not just sounds, they were forces, and in the wrong hands they were weapons of immense destructive power. Number 10, women's voices were not silent. The world of the Skalds appears, at first glance, to be a man's world. The sagas are filled with the stories of male poets serving male kings and jarls, composing poems about battles fought by men. The vast majority of the surviving Skaldic poetry is attributed to men, but this is not the complete picture. Hidden in the margins of the historical record, there are traces of female skalds, women who mastered the complex art of poetry and whose voices, though faint, have not been entirely silenced. They were known as Skaldkonur. One of the most notable is Jorunn Skaldmar, the Skald Maiden. We know very little about her life. She likely lived in Norway in the first half of the 10th century. What we do have is a powerful fragment of her work, a poem called Sendibiter Message Biter. The poem is preserved because Snorri Sturluson and other later saga writers quoted from it in their own works. Snorri considered it an important historical source. The poem describes a major conflict within the ruling family of Norway. It tells of the sons of King Harald Fairhair fighting amongst themselves after his death. Specifically, it describes a settlement negotiated between Harald's son, Eric Bloodaxe, and another son, Halfdan the Black. Jorunn's poem is a contemporary account of this political event. It is a piece of historical reportage, just like the poems of her male counterparts. Her language is as complex and skillful as any male skald's. She uses intricate kennings and follows the strict rules of Drottkavet. She refers to the conflict as the wound dew's weather, a kenning for battle. She speaks from a position of knowledge, as someone who understands the political situation intimately. The fact that later, male historians like Snorri treated her poem as a reliable source shows the respect she commanded. She was not seen as a lesser poet because she was a woman. Her work was judged on its quality, and it was judged to be excellent. We don't know the context of her performance. Did she recite this poem in a king's hall, just as a male skald would have? It's possible, or perhaps women's poetry was performed in different, more domestic settings. The sagas are largely silent on this. Other female skalds appear in the sagas. There is Steinunn Refstotir, an Icelandic woman who, around the year 1000, engaged in a poetic duel with a Christian missionary named Thangbrander. When Thangbrander's ship was wrecked in a storm, he claimed it was the power of his god punishing the heathens. Steinunn composed a series of verses mocking him. She claimed that the god Thor had wrecked his ship and that the Christian god was powerless. Verses are defiant and witty, a powerful defense of the old religion. There is also Thorhildr Skaldkona, who was the wife of a famous Icelandic chieftain. She composed a scathing verse about a man who had stolen some of her flour. The verse is a small domestic complaint, but it is crafted with the skill of a trained skald. It shows that the art of poetry was not just for the high politics of kings, but could also be used to comment on the everyday lives and frustrations of women. The voices of these women are fragmented. We only have a few stanzas from each, preserved because they were quoted by later writers who were interested in the events the poems described, not necessarily in the poets themselves. It is almost certain that there were many more skaldkonur whose work has been lost. The oral tradition that preserved the poetry of male skalds may not have valued the work of women in the same way. When the poems began to be written down in the 12th and 13th centuries, it was mostly monks and male scholars who were doing the writing, and they may have chosen to record the poems they considered most important, which were usually those about kings and battles. But even these few surviving fragments are a powerful secret. They tell us that the intellectual and artistic world of the Vikings was not closed to women. But women could and did master the most difficult and prestigious art form of their culture. They used poetry to record history, to argue theology, and to express personal anger. They were active participants in the literary life of their time. Their voices may be quiet, but they are there, waiting to be listened to. Number 9, old forms were filled with new faith. The conversion of Scandinavia to Christianity in the 10th and 11th centuries was a time of immense cultural upheaval. It was not just a change of religion, it was a collision of worldviews. For the Skalds, it presented a fundamental challenge. Their entire art form was built on a foundation of pagan mythology. The kennings and heti that were the building blocks of their poetry were deeply rooted in the stories of Odin, Thor, and the other gods of the Norse pantheon. How could a Christian poet praise a Christian king or a Christian god using the language of heathens? The secret is that they did not abandon their art. They adapted it. The Skalds of the Christian era performed a remarkable act of cultural fusion. They took the old complex form of Dratvat and repurposed it to serve their new faith. They poured new wine into old bottles. One of the earliest examples of this transition is the Skald Ilafur Gudrunarsson. He lived in the late 10th century, a time when Christianity was beginning to make serious inroads in Norway. Eilifur seems to have lived through this change himself. We have two major poems attributed to him. One is pagan, the other is Christian. The first is the Thorsdrapa, a magnificent poem that tells the story of the god Thor's journey to the land of the giants. It is a masterpiece of the old style. It is packed with incredibly complex and obscure kennings, some of which are still debated by scholars today. It is a powerful, vivid, and deeply pagan work. It is one of our most important sources for the myth it describes. But Eilifur also composed another poem, the Krakudrapa. This poem is about Christ. In it, Eilifur uses the traditional skaldic form, Drottkvet, to praise his new lord. But he faces a problem. How do you describe the Christian god using kennings? There were no ancient myths about Christ fighting giants or drinking with other gods. So Eilifur had to innovate. He creates new kennings. He calls God the King of Rome or the King of Monks. He refers to him as the guardian of the Greeks and Russians, reflecting the reach of Christianity. In one famous stanza, he says that Christ sits at the southern slope by the Well of Erd. The Well of Erd is a central location in Norse mythology, the place where the fates of gods and men are decided. By placing Christ in this mythological landscape, Eilifur is performing a powerful act of synthesis. He is not simply replacing the old gods with the new one. He is claiming the sacred geography of the old faith for his new one. He is saying that Christ now rules in the very heart of the old cosmos. This process of adaptation continued for centuries. Skalds in the service of Christian kings like Saint Olaf had to find new ways to praise them. They couldn't call the king a feeder of ravens if he was trying to present himself as a peaceful Christian ruler. So they developed a new set of Christian kennings. The king became the servant of God, or the defender of the church. In battle was no longer just the storm of swords. It could be a holy war fought against heathens. The most famous Christian skaldic poem is probably Lilja the Lily, composed in the 14th century by the monk Eystein Asgrimsson. It is a long poem of 100 stanzas retelling the whole of Christian sacred history from creation to the Last Judgment. It is written in a modified, slightly simpler skaldic meter called rinhent, but it still uses the old techniques of alliteration and internal rhyme. It is a work of profound religious feeling, but its artistic DNA is purely Norse. Eystein even begins the poem with a traditional skaldic introduction, asking for silence in the hall so that his poem may be heard. The survival of skaldic poetry in the Christian era is a secret of cultural resilience. The poets did not see a contradiction between their ancient art form and their new faith. They saw the Drottvad meter not as an inherently pagan thing, but as a vessel, a beautiful and complex container for meaning. It was a technology of language. They took this powerful tool, which had been perfected to praise pagan gods and warrior kings, and they used it to explore the mysteries of the Christian faith. In doing so, they ensured that the voice of the skald would continue to be heard for centuries after the temples of Odin and Thor had fallen into ruin. Number 8, Iceland was a poet factory. For several centuries, from the 10th to the 13th, a strange and remarkable thing happened in the courts of Scandinavia and beyond. If a king in Norway, a jarl in the Orkney Islands, or even a ruler in Dublin wanted to hire the best poet, the most skilled master of the skaldic art, he almost always hired an Icelander. In Iceland, a small, remote island with a population of only a few tens of thousands, became the undisputed center of skaldic poetry. It was a poet factory exporting its most talented literary artists to the courts of the wealthy and powerful. Why did this happen? The secret lies in the unique social and political structure of Iceland. Unlike Norway or Denmark, Iceland had no king. It was a commonwealth, a republic of farmers and chieftains governed by a legal assembly called the Althing. There was no royal court, no central source of patronage to support a class of professional poets. This might seem like a disadvantage, but it created a unique set of circumstances. In Norway, a skald was typically attached to the court of a single king. His career was tied to the fortunes of his patron. In Iceland, a skald was a free agent. He was often the son of a wealthy farmer, a man of property and status in his own right. Poetry was not his only profession. It was a specialized skill he could use to increase his wealth and prestige. The lack of a local court forced ambitious Icelandic skalds to travel. They had to seek their fortunes abroad. They became cultural mercenaries, selling their skills to the highest bidder. This created a highly competitive environment. An Icelandic skald arriving at the Norwegian court had to be better than the local poets. He had to prove his worth immediately. This constant competition drove up the quality of their work. The sagas are full of stories of Icelandic poets outshining their rivals. Furthermore, Icelandic society was intensely interested in law, genealogy, and history. The annual meetings of the Althing were not just legal proceedings, they were great social gatherings where news was exchanged, stories were told, and poems were recited. This created a highly literate, albeit oral, culture. Every Icelandic chieftain needed to know his family history, the law, and the stories of the past. The skaldic poetry, which preserved all of these things, was held in the highest esteem. The art was practiced and appreciated not just by a small courtly elite, but throughout the society. An Icelandic farmer might be just as capable of composing a competent verse as a Norwegian jarl. Snorri Sturluson, the great 13th century Icelandic writer, commented on this phenomenon. He noted that the Icelanders had a special role in preserving the old poetry and the knowledge needed to understand it. By his time, skaldic poetry was falling out of fashion in Norway. The Norwegian court was becoming more European, adopting simpler French-style ballads. But in Iceland, the old, complex art of Drottvad was still being practiced and studied. Snorri himself wrote the Prose Edda partly as a textbook to ensure that this knowledge would not be lost. He was an Icelander trying to preserve a tradition that his own people had perfected, but that was dying out elsewhere. Consider the court of King Harald Hardrada of Norway, who ruled in the mid-11th century. Harald was a great warrior and a connoisseur of poetry. The sagas say he had a whole company of Skalds, and the most prominent among them were Icelanders. Men like Tjodolfur Arnarsson, who became Harald's chief skald, and Stufr in Blindi, Stuf the Blind, who entertained the king with long genealogical poems. Harald valued his Icelandic poets so much that he placed them in his shield wall during the Battle of Stamford Bridge in 1066. He wanted them to witness the battle firsthand so they could compose an accurate and vivid account of it. Several of them died there. The dominance of the Icelandic Skalds was a remarkable cultural phenomenon. And a small, remote island lacking the usual structures of royal patronage produced the most celebrated literary artists of the Viking Age. They were a product of their unique society, independent, competitive, and obsessed with their own history and laws. They took their national art form, polished it to perfection, and exported it, making the Icelandic tongue the language of praise in every great hall from Dublin to Sweden. Number 7. Poems are a museum of lost things. Skaldic poems are not just words. They are artifacts. They are a museum of a lost world, preserving in their dense verses the details of a material culture that has otherwise vanished. Because a skald was often an eyewitness to the events he described, and because he composed for an audience that valued accuracy and detail, his poems give us a unique window into the world of the Vikings. They show us the things they valued, the weapons they used, the ships they sailed, and the art they admired. Take, for example, the shields. A Viking shield was a practical piece of military equipment made of wood and leather, with an iron boss in the center. But for a high-status warrior, it could also be a work of art, painted with scenes from myth and legend. These painted shields have not survived. The wood and leather have long since rotted away, but we know they existed because the Skalds described them. Bragi Bodeson's Ragnarsdrapa from the 9th century is one of the earliest examples. The entire poem is a description of the myths painted on a shield given to him by a king named Ragnar. Bragi describes 4 scenes in detail: a battle involving a legendary hero, the god Thor fishing for the Midgard serpent, the goddess Gefjun plowing land from Sweden, and the eternal battle of 2 heroes, Hedin and Hogni. Without this poem, we would have a much poorer understanding of these myths. But just as importantly, the poem is physical proof of the existence of this kind of high-status decorative art. And it tells us that a shield could be a canvas for complex narrative scenes. Another skald, Theodulf of Hvenir, the same poet who composed the Yngling Attal, created a similar poem called Hauslong Autumn Long, because it took him a long time to compose. This poem also describes scenes from mythology painted on a shield. He describes the myth of the giant Jazi kidnapping the goddess Idun, and a detailed picture of the god Thor fighting the giant Hrungnir. He describes Thor's hammer, Mjolnir, flying through the air, and Hrungnir's great stone shield. These poems are our only detailed textual evidence for this tradition of shield painting. The swords were another object of immense value and prestige. A fine sword might have a name, a history, and a hilt inlaid with gold and silver. Skaldic poetry is filled with kennings for swords that hint at their appearance and function. They are the ice of battle, the flame of the wound, the serpent of the shield. One skald, Hallfredur Vandredeskald, describes a sword hilt so well made that it seems to have 3 men's work in it. Another poem mentions a hilt wound serpent, a kenning that probably refers to a sword with a pattern welded blade, where different kinds of iron were twisted and forged together to create a wavy, snake-like pattern. This matches archaeological finds of such blades. The poems give us the language and the cultural context for the artifacts that archaeologists dig out of the ground. Ships, the key to Viking expansion and wealth, are also described in detail. A king's longship was his most important possession. The Skalds gave them magnificent names. They were the Fjord Elk, the Wave Boar, the Ski of the Sea King. The poems describe their carved prows, often shaped like dragons or other beasts. They talk about the painted shields hung along the gunwales, making the ship look like a fortress on the water. In the Heimskringla, Snorri Sturluson quotes a skald describing King Olaf Tryggvason's great ship, the Long Serpent. The poem praises its size, its gilded prow, and its fearsome appearance. It brings the archaeological remains of Viking ships to life, populating them with men and giving them purpose. The poems are a catalog of the Viking world. They mention arm rings of gold, helmets with nose guards, mail coats called battle shirts, banners woven with the image of a raven, and great halls with carved pillars. These objects are not just background details. They are central to the poems because they were central to the culture. They were symbols of wealth, status, and power. The Skalds described them because their patrons wanted to be remembered in connection with them. When we read these poems, we are not just reading literature, we are archaeologists of the mind. The verses are the soil, and buried within the complex layers of kennings and meter are the glittering fragments of a lost material world. The poems are a museum of things we can no longer see, a precious inventory of the art and technology of the Viking Age. Number 6. The poet stood between two worlds. The 12th and 13th centuries in Iceland were a time of profound change. The old oral culture that had sustained the Skalds for centuries was giving way to a new culture of the written word, where Christianity had brought with it the Latin alphabet and the technology of writing on vellum. For the first time, the ancient poems, the sagas, and the laws began to be recorded. This was the moment when oral tradition was transformed into written literature. The figures who stood at the center of this transformation were the Skalds themselves. They were the bridge between these two worlds. One such figure was Sturla Thordarson. He was born in 1214 into the powerful Sturlung clan, the most dominant family in Iceland during the violent period of civil war known as the Age of the Sturlungs. He was the nephew of the famous Snorri Sturluson. Like his uncle, Sturla was both a politician and a man of letters. He was a chieftain, a law speaker, the highest official in the old Icelandic Commonwealth, and one of the last great skalds of the classical tradition. Sturla's life was turbulent. He was a key player in the civil wars, sometimes winning, sometimes losing, sometimes forced into exile. In 1263, he found himself in Norway, at the court of King Magnus Håkonarsson. Sturla was in a difficult position. He had been on the losing side of a conflict in which the Norwegian king had been involved. His enemies were at the king's court, slandering him. But King Magnus was angry with him. Sturla's life could have been in danger. He did what a skald had done for centuries in such a situation. He composed a great praise poem, a drapa, in honor of the king. But he also did something new. He wrote it down. The saga about him, Sturlu Saga, says he worked on the poem in private and then presented it to the king. He recited it in the traditional way, but the poem was also a physical object, a text. This was a new development. The poem was a success. King Magnus was so impressed with Sturla's skill that he took him into his favor and made him his court skald. Sturla's new job was not just to compose poems, but to write history. King Magnus commissioned him to write the official history of his reign, and also the history of his father, King Håkon Håkonarsson. This is where Sturla becomes a pivotal figure. He wrote Håkonar Saga Håkonarssonar, a long and detailed prose history of the king he had served. It is one of the most important historical sources for 13th century Norway, but how did he write it? He used the methods of a modern historian, gathering documents and interviewing eyewitnesses, but he also used the methods of an old skald. He relied on the skaldic poems composed during King Hakon's lifetime, including his own, as primary sources. He often quotes stanzas of poetry within his prose narrative to verify a fact or to provide a vivid contemporary description of a battle or an event. In Sturla Thordarson, the two traditions meet. He is an oral performer, a master of drotkvet, who can win a king's favor with a recited poem. But he is also a writer, an author who sits with a pen and vellum, carefully constructing a complex prose narrative. He saw no contradiction between these two roles. For him, the old poems were not just art, they were historical documents, the raw material from which written history could be built. The transition from an oral to a written culture was not without its losses. Something has always changed when a fluid, performed art is frozen onto a page. The nuances of recitation, the tone of voice, the rhythm, the dramatic pauses are lost. The poem becomes a purely visual object to be read silently by an individual rather than a communal auditory experience. But the gains were immense. The act of writing the poems down saved them from being forgotten. Without the work of 13th century Icelandic scribes and authors like Snorri and Sturla, almost the entire corpus of skaldic poetry would have vanished. These men stood with one foot in the old world of the Viking Age hall and the other in the new world of the medieval European scriptorium. They were the keepers of the flame, the ones who ensured that the complex, powerful voices of the Skalds would not fade into silence, but would be preserved for future generations to study and admire. Number 5, ambiguity was a survival skill. In the dangerous, politically charged world of a Viking court, a careless word could be fatal. A skald whose entire profession was based on words had to be a master of careful communication. He praised his patron, the king, but he had to do so without offending other powerful men in the hall. He recorded the king's victories, but he might have to gloss over his defeats. One of the most important and least understood secrets of the Skalds was their mastery of ambiguity. A good poem could mean more than one thing at the same time. It could carry a hidden message, a subtle warning, or a piece of deniable criticism. This ambiguity was made possible by the very structure of the poetry. The grammar of a Drottkvedt stanza was famously complex. The word order was not fixed, as it is in modern English, because Old Norse was a highly inflected language, meaning words changed their endings to show their grammatical function. A poet could move the words around in a sentence to fit the demands of the meter without making the sentence technically ungrammatical. This led to a style called temesis, where a single thought, or even a single compound word like a kenning, could be split up and scattered across several lines of a stanza with other phrases and clauses interwoven. For a modern reader, this makes the poetry incredibly difficult to puzzle out, but for the original audience, it created a rich tapestry of potential meanings. A phrase could be read as belonging to one part of the sentence or another, creating a deliberate double meaning. A classic example is attributed to the skald Hallfredur Vandræðaskald, the troublesome poet. He was in the service of Jarl Hakon of Norway in the late 10th century, but he was also secretly leaning towards the new Christian faith. He composed a poem for the Jarl, a powerful pagan ruler. In one stanza, he seems to praise the Jarl's pagan sacrifices, but the wording is cleverly ambiguous. One line can be read as saying, "The wise prince reddens the high gallows of the horse sacrifice with blood." This is a straightforward pagan image, but because of the flexible word order, it could also be interpreted differently, perhaps with a shade of irony or distance. The poet could praise the pagan rite to please his patron, while also subtly signaling his own detachment from it. This technique was especially useful when a skald changed patrons. A poet might leave the service of one king and enter the service of his rival. He would then be expected to compose a poem praising his new lord. But what if he had previously composed poems praising his old one? The skald Arnor Jarl Askald faced this problem in the 11th century. He had been the poet for the Jarls of Orkney, but later entered the service of the King of Norway, their rival. In a poem for the Norwegian king, he praises him for his victories. He uses a kenning for battle, the sharp song of the Valkyrie's geese. Geese of the Valkyrie is a kenning for ravens, birds of battle. But the word for geese could also be related to a word for speech or song. So, the line could also hint at the sharp song of the poets, referring to his own praise poems for his former patrons. He is praising his new king, but also subtly acknowledging his own past work and the complex web of loyalties that a professional poet had to navigate. The ultimate master of this was probably Snorri Sturluson. As a political chieftain in 13th century Iceland, he was deeply involved in the intrigues between the Icelandic factions and the Norwegian king. In his historical work, the Heimskringla, he uses the old skaldic poems as sources, but he chooses his quotations very carefully. He often uses an ambiguous stanza to support his own political interpretation of an event. He uses the ancient poet's skill at ambiguity to further his own political goals. For a skald, ambiguity was a survival tool. It allowed him to speak truth to power, but to do so in a way that gave him plausible deniability. It allowed him to navigate the treacherous currents of court politics, to praise one man without mortally offending another. A poem could be a public statement of loyalty, but it could also contain a private reservation, a hidden meaning that only the most sophisticated listeners would understand. The secret was not just in what the poem said, but in what it didn't say, or what it might say, if you looked at it in just the right way. It was a language of shadows and echoes, perfectly suited to the world of the court. Number 4, their history was always an argument. We tend to think of history as a neutral account of past events, but the Skalds knew better. They knew that history was a story, and that the person who told the story had the power to shape the present. A skaldic poem that recorded a king's deeds was never just a record. It was an argument. It was a carefully constructed piece of rhetoric designed to persuade the listener that the skald's patron was brave, generous, and destined to rule. The skald was not an objective reporter. He was the king's spin doctor. Snorri Sturluson, in the preface to his Heimskringla, makes a famous argument for the truthfulness of skaldic poetry. He says we should trust the poems because they were performed in front of the kings themselves, who would have known if the poet was lying. This is true, up to a point. A skald could not invent a battle that never happened, but he had enormous power to interpret the events he described. Consider the praise poem, the drapa. It was the highest form of the art. A standard drapa had a specific structure. It began with an introduction asking for a hearing. The main body of the poem would list the patron's great deeds, usually his victories in battle. It would often have a recurring refrain called a stef that was repeated at intervals throughout the poem, hammering home the central message of praise. The poem would conclude by wishing the patron a long life and continued success. The content of this main section was highly selective. The skald would focus on the king's successes and ignore his failures. If a battle was a draw, the poem would present it as a great victory. If the king's army had to retreat, the poem would describe it as a clever strategic withdrawal. The poet would use all his skill with kennings and imagery to portray his patron as an unstoppable force of nature. The king's enemies were never brave warriors fighting for their own cause. They were treacherous cowards who deserved their fate. A good example is the work of Jodolfr Arnarsson, the chief poet of King Harald Hardrada. Harald was a famously brutal and ambitious ruler. His life was one of constant warfare. Jodolfr's job was to turn this bloody career into a heroic saga. He composed a long cycle of poems called the Sextifja, the six refrain poem, which chronicled Harald's battles. In the poem, Harald is always the hero. His actions, which another observer might describe as ruthless aggression, are portrayed as righteous and necessary. The poem constructs a heroic persona for the king. It is a piece of political branding. Sometimes different skalds, serving different lords, would offer conflicting accounts of the same event. After the Battle of Anissa in 1062, a massive sea battle between the Danish king Svein Ulfsson and the Norwegian king Harald Hardrada, both sides claimed victory. The skalds on both sides composed poems to prove their king's claim. Snorri, writing his history later, had to weigh these conflicting poetic accounts. He quotes from both sides, trying to reconstruct what really happened. He acts as a judge, evaluating the arguments made by the skalds. This is the true secret of skaldic history. It was not a simple record of facts. It was a courtroom drama, with each skald acting as a lawyer for his client. The poem was his legal brief, his closing argument. The audience, both at the original performance and later readers of the sagas, was the jury. The Skalds were not trying to create an objective history for future generations. They were trying to win an argument in the present. They were fighting a war of reputation, a battle for the control of memory, and they knew exactly what they were doing. The Skald Sivetr Thordarson, in a poem about his patron King Olaf, frankly admits that it is his job to remember and publicize the king's deeds. He says, "It is my duty to remember the number of the prince's battles. I make his great fame known." He doesn't pretend to be a neutral observer. He is an active participant in the creation of the king's legacy. He is a historian, but a historian with an agenda. His work reminds us that all history is a form of storytelling, and that behind every story is an argument. Number 3, the art was designed to die. For all its complexity and power, the great art of the Skalds was ultimately a fragile thing. It was an oral tradition dependent on a living chain of masters and apprentices, and on a society that valued its unique, difficult beauty. When that society changed, the art was doomed. The decline of skaldic poetry in the 13th and 14th centuries was not a simple change in literary taste. It was the end of a world. The secret of its end is that the very things that made it great were also the things that made it vulnerable. The first blow was a change in the political landscape. The old Viking world of competing kings and independent jarls was giving way to more centralized European-style monarchies. The royal courts in Norway and Denmark began to look to the south, to France and Germany, for their cultural models. The old, intricate Drottkvat started to sound archaic and provincial. The new fashion was for chivalric romances and simple rhyming ballads. A king who wanted to appear modern and sophisticated no longer wanted a skald who praised him as a feeder of ravens. He wanted a troubadour who sang of courtly love. The language itself was also changing. Old Norse was evolving into the different Scandinavian languages we know today: Norwegian, Swedish, Danish, and Icelandic. The complex grammar and vocabulary of the old poetic language became harder and harder for people to understand. In Iceland, the language changed more slowly, which is one reason why the tradition survived there longer. But even in Iceland, the old kennings, based on a pagan mythology that few people still knew in detail, began to lose their power. And Snorri Sturluson's Prose Edda was a desperate attempt to keep this knowledge alive, a textbook for an art form that was becoming a dead language. The rise of literacy was another factor. The Skald's art was a product of an oral culture. Its complex rules served as a memory aid. Its performance was a communal, social event. When poetry became something that was written down and read in private, these functions became less important. A writer composing a poem on a page did not need the same kind of mental scaffolding as a skald composing in his head. Simpler, more literary forms of poetry began to emerge. The social role of the poet also changed. The old Icelandic Commonwealth, which had produced so many great independent skalds, collapsed in the 13th century. As Iceland came under the rule of the Norwegian king, the class of proud, educated chieftains who had been the patrons and practitioners of the art was decimated by civil war. The new poets were often churchmen or scholars, not warriors and politicians. Their concerns were different. They were more likely to write a religious poem like Lilja than a battle poem for a king. By the 14th century, classical skaldic poetry was effectively dead. People still composed poetry in Iceland, but it was in new, simpler meters. The art of Drottkvat, with its syllable counts, its alliteration, its two kinds of internal rhyme, and its convoluted kennings, was too difficult to compose and too obscure to be understood. The last great master was probably Sturla Thordarson. After him, there were only echoes. The end of the skaldic tradition is a lesson in cultural change. The art was a perfect expression of the Viking Age mind complex, hierarchical, obsessed with honor, fame, and the power of memory. It was a machine built of sound, a secret code, a political weapon, a legal document, but it was a machine designed for a specific purpose in a specific world. When that world vanished, the machine fell silent. Its very complexity, its resistance to change, its reliance on a deep shared body of ancient knowledge, these were the secrets of its strength and also the reasons for its demise. It was too perfectly adapted to a world that no longer existed. It was an art that was designed to die. Number 2, Snorri Sturluson was not saving the past, he was using it. Snorri Sturluson is the hero of this story. He was an Icelandic chieftain, politician, and writer who lived from 1179 to 1241. Without him, our knowledge of Norse mythology and skaldic poetry would be a fraction of what it is. He wrote the Prose Edda, the textbook that explains the myths and decodes the kennings. He wrote the Heimskringla, the epic history of the kings of Norway, which quotes and preserves hundreds of stanzas of skaldic verse. He is often seen as a great antiquarian, a scholar who dedicated his life to saving the cultural heritage of his people from the forgetting of time. But this is only half the story. The greatest secret, the one that reframes everything we think we know about the Skalds, is this: Snorri was not a neutral preserver of the past. He was an active, ambitious, and ruthless politician who was using the past for his own purposes in the present. His books are not just works of scholarship, they are political documents designed to advance his own power and the interests of his family. Snorri lived during the Age of the Sturlungs, a brutal civil war in Iceland. He was one of the most powerful chieftains in the country. He was also deeply involved in the politics of Norway. He made several trips to the Norwegian court and for a time was a vassal of the Norwegian king, Hakon Hakonarson. His political career was a series of alliances and betrayals, a constant struggle for power and wealth. He was eventually assassinated in his own home by his political rivals on the orders of the Norwegian king he had once served. This is the man who wrote the books. We have to read them with this in mind. When Snorri wrote the Heimskringla, he was not just telling the story of the old kings of Norway. He was making an argument about the nature of kingship and the proper relationship between Norway and Iceland. By telling the stories of the great Icelandic Skalds who served the Norwegian kings, he was reminding the current king of the long and valuable service that Icelanders had provided. He was implicitly arguing for the importance of men like himself, educated Icelanders, who understood the shared history of the two nations. His use of skaldic poetry in the Heimskringla is a masterclass in political rhetoric. He presents the poems as unimpeachable sources, the testimony of eyewitnesses. But he is the one who chooses which poems to quote. He is the one who provides the prose context that tells the reader how to interpret the poem. He uses the authority of the ancient skalds to support his own version of history, a version that often subtly glorifies his own ancestors or supports his political positions. Even the Prose Edda, which seems like a more neutral scholarly work, can be read politically. It is, on one level, a handbook for young poets. But why did Snorri think it was so important to train new poets in the old style? Because skaldic skill was a passport to the courts of power. It was a way for an ambitious Icelander to gain wealth and influence in Norway. By writing a textbook for the art, Snorri was trying to ensure that Icelanders would continue to possess this valuable cultural capital. He was shoring up a source of Icelandic influence abroad. He was also making a statement about Icelandic cultural superiority. By his time, the art was dying in Norway. By writing the definitive book on the subject, Snorri, an Icelander, was positioning himself as the ultimate authority on the history and literature of the Norwegian kingdom. It was a subtle but powerful power move. Snorri was a genius. He was a brilliant writer and a profound scholar. He almost single-handedly saved the world of Norse myth and poetry for us, but he was not a dispassionate academic in an ivory tower. He was a political player, and his books were his weapons. He loved the old poems, but he also understood their power. He knew that the person who controls the story of the past can control the future. He did not just preserve the secrets of the Skalds. He used them. And that is his ultimate secret. Number 1, the poem is never finished. The final secret is the most important one. It is the one that allows us to hear the voices of the Skalds today. The poem is never finished. We think of a poem or a story as a fixed object created by an author at a specific point in time. But For most of their history, skaldic poems were not like that. They were fluid, living things, existing only in the moment of performance and in the memories of those who heard them. A skald composing a poem for a king in the 10th century was the beginning of a long journey. The poem would be performed in the hall. Other people would hear it and memorize it. Some of them might be skalds themselves who would then travel to other courts and perform the poem again. In this process of retelling, the poem could change. A line might be forgotten and replaced. A stanza might be added to praise a new patron. The poem was not a static text, it was a living piece of the oral tradition. For 200 or 300 years, these poems lived in this way, passed from memory to memory, from voice to voice. Then, in the 13th century in Iceland, they were written down. Men like Snorri Sturluson and his nephew Sturla Thordarson captured them on vellum. This was a crucial moment of preservation, but it was also a moment of transformation. The fluid, performed utterance became a fixed, visual text. The version that one particular scribe chose to write down became, for all future generations, the official version. We have no way of knowing how many other versions, how many small variations were lost in this process. But the journey wasn't over. The manuscripts themselves were copied, and in the process of copying, new errors could be introduced or new corrections made. Then came the age of modern scholarship. In the 19th and 20th centuries, scholars in Scandinavia, Germany, and the English-speaking world began to study these manuscripts. And they were like textual archaeologists. They compared different manuscript versions, tried to correct scribal errors, and attempted to reconstruct the original poem as they imagined the first skald had composed it. They translated the poems into modern languages, but a translation is always an interpretation. A single kenning can be translated in multiple ways. A translator has to make a choice. The well road could become the gannet's bath. The storm of swords could become the clash of blades. Each translation creates a new version of the poem, a new performance of it for a new audience, and now you are reading this. You are the next stage in the poem's life. The words of Tjóðolfr of Vínar or Egil Skallagrimsson, composed over 1,000 years ago, have traveled from the mind of a poet in a Viking hall, through the memories of generations, onto the pen of a 13th century Icelandic scribe, through the hands of countless librarians and scholars, through the process of translation and interpretation, and have finally reached you. When you read these poems, or read about them, you are participating in their continued existence. You are lending them your mind, your imagination. You are, for a moment, the audience in the hall. The poem is being performed again, inside your head. It is not a dead artifact in a museum. It is a living voice, and it is speaking to you. This is the ultimate secret. The Skalds sought to create fame for their kings, to make their names immortal. But in the process, they achieved a kind of immortality for themselves. Their art was so powerful, so complex, and so deeply human that it has refused to die. It has survived the fall of kingdoms, the change of religions, and the death of the language in which it was born. The poem is never finished because as long as one person is left to read it, to puzzle over it, to feel its power, the performance continues. The voice of the skald is still speaking, and you are listening.